evening, peoples. I'm Pastor Leia, and this here is my friend Ginger Snap. So welcome back to our living room for our ongoing Bible study series on the Apostles, of which there may or may not be more than 12, depending on which list you are going by. So in our previous session, we talked about John, who of course is one of the good guys, may or may not have written the Gospel of John, does good things, miracles, etc. Anyway, in the complete opposite of that theme, this week we get to talk about Judas Iscariot. So if you're watching this, I'm going to assume that you know that Judas is kind of the villain, which makes him an interesting and complicated character. So his name, Judas, comes from the Hebrew Judah, which means God is thanked. And he is, of course, not to be confused with Judas Maccabeus, who is the hero of the Hanukkah story, which isn't in our Bible, but which many of us still know. Not to be confused with, and I quote, Judas not Iscariot. We'll get to him next week. Yeah, I know, it's very confusing that there's so many people with the same name. Thank you for that comment, Ginger Snap. He's also not to be confused with Jude, the brother of Judas, or Judas Barsabbas, or Judas the Galilean, who are both in the book of Acts. I feel like there's a third or a fourth Judas in there too. Not the point. He's not those either. And he's also not Jude, the brother of James, who may or may not have written the Epistle of Jude, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, although, unlike like the Jameses or the Marys, you probably weren't going to confuse Judas Iscariot with Judas anyone else. Anyway, so Iscariot probably means coming from the city of Cariot, kind of like Mary Magdalene is Mary from the city of Magdala. So some fun facts from a very, very brief Google this afternoon. 6 U.S. babies were named Judas in the year 2017. 6. As opposed to, in the same year, 18 babies were named Ebenezer, which is also a name with some negative connotations, which is interesting. I like the name Ebenezer from the Hebrew Eben Etzer. This far I have come by God's help. I think it's a great name, but no. Charles Dickens had to go and ruin a perfectly good name for us. Anyway, so Google also says, this one really blows my mind. In the year 2000, again, just according to Google, there were 8 babies in the U.S. named Adolf, but none named Judas. So, yeah, that's... make of that what you will. So, I wanted to start off with a reading from Matthew 19. I've just got my readings on screen tonight because otherwise someone here likes to paw at books. So in Matthew 19, 27-30, then Peter said in reply, "Look, we have left everything and followed you," says to Jesus. "What then will we have?" Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man is seated on the throne of his glory, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or fields for my name's sake will receive 100-fold and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first." So Jesus is referring to the 12 of you, which is to say the 12 disciples, which at the point of Matthew 19 very much still includes Judas. So is he saying that Judas is going to get a throne alongside, Peter and all of the, good guys? Which is very interesting. It might be pointed out that until the very end of the stories, in all 4 Gospels, Judas doesn't really stand out as being rebellious or argumentative or like in any way a problem child or problem disciple. Like when Jesus at the Last Supper is like, "Hey, so one of you guys is going to betray me anyway, so we're having bread now," and the whole room is like, "I'm sorry, Jesus, can you rewind a second to the bit where one of us is going to betray you?" Like, are we talking about the same room of people? Because, like, all of us are very, very pro-Jesus, and, yeah, that's just, like, absurd if one of us would betray you. Whereas, in retrospect, we might think, at least half of the room is like, well, I mean, I hate to think it of the guy, but if any of us were to betray him, it would be Judas, right? But that's not the response. Everyone in the room is like, "What are you talking about?" So that's interesting. Like, we kind of know the ending of this story going into any time that we read the Gospels. But if you're reading it from beginning to end and you don't know, then yeah, that's a kind of abrupt, unexpected twist in the story that Judas would betray Jesus. So I just wanted to start with that thought as before we go on. So later in Matthew, a few readings from Matthew 26. Then one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I betray Jesus to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. So in this version of the story, it's slightly different in the next gospel. Judas is the one taking the initiative to go to the priest and like, hey, what will you give me? Which is interesting. So anyway, then we fast forward a couple of verses to the Last Supper. Fast forward and rewind. I feel like I'm showing my age in this video. Anyway, and while they were eating, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." And they became greatly distressed and began to say to him, one after another, "Surely not I, Lord." Jesus answered, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." Judas, who betrayed him, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." Jesus replied, "You have said so." So then in Mark chapter 14, slightly different from Judas going to the chief priests of his own accord, then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. When they heard it, they were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. So he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. So in Matthew, Judas is like, "Hey, what you gonna give me?" And in Mark, the priests are like, "How much would it take?" So it's a slight difference, but anyway. And then the scene at the dinner table is basically the same. So in the Gospel of Luke, Judas isn't actually named until the actual betrayal and arrest, not address. So at the supper, Jesus says, "But see, the one who betrays me is with me, and his hand is on the table. For the Son of Man is going as it has been determined, but woe to that one by whom he is betrayed." Then they began to ask one another which one of them it could be who would do this. But the narrator, come back up here, don't just sit there and look at me. The narrator doesn't point to Judas, just kind of leaves it as a mystery to be determined. So then John does kind of have a slightly different version again. So John writes in chapter 13, "After saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, 'Very truly I tell you, one of you will betray me.' The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved," we talked about this last time, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask of Jesus of whom he was speaking. So while reclining next to Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After he received the piece of bread, Satan entered into him. I might translate, because Satan, or Satanas in the Greek, is not a literal singular figure. It's just like an adversary. So maybe a sense of, argument or opposition. Anyway, it's more like a feeling of being opposed to something rather than red dude with horns is like, "Oh, I'm inside, Anyway, he turned into him. Jesus said to Judas, "Do quickly what you are going to do." Now, no one at the table knew why Jesus said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the common purse, Jesus was telling him, "Buy what we need for the festival," or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the piece of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. So there's a bit more drama and background there. I do also want to mention, in addition to my little beef against the word Satanas being translated as Satan, capital S. So the verb translated here as betray is paradidomi in the Greek, which our Bible translates as betray in all of these verses, but it kind of more means give or deliver or offer. Does that necessarily reflect better on Judas? No, not necessarily exactly, but like still I think it's interesting because, I mean, the end result is still the same, but I feel like deliver is a bit more neutral maybe than betray is. Anyway, so going on a little bit after dinner, in Matthew 26 again, while Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him." At once, Judas came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. This is a really odd moment to choose to purr, Gingersnap. Cats. Then Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. Suddenly, one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, who will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say it must happen in this way?" So the story in Mark is very similar, and the story in Luke is also very similar. In John, it's basically the same story, but there's no kiss of betrayal in John, which I think is interesting. I feel like there must be some kind of significance there, but I don't know enough about first century culture to quite know what that is. So in John 18, after Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked them, "For whom are you looking?" They replied, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "For whom are you looking?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you are looking for me, let these men go." So there's a bit more of a confrontation there. The action is between Jesus and the crowd coming to arrest him, rather than the action, like the spotlight being between Jesus and Judas per se. So again, same end result, but a slightly different angle, I suppose. So then as we know, Jesus is arrested and then dies. He comes back, so that's a thing that happens that we celebrated last month. So but somewhere in between those two stories, in Matthew 27, we read that Judas dies by suicide. So Matthew 27, 3-10, when Judas, the betrayer of Jesus, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. He said, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they said, "What is that to us? See to it yourself." Throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, Judas departed, and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said, "It's not lawful to put them into the treasury, since they are blood money." After conferring together, they used them to buy the potter's field as a place to bury foreigners. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one on whom a price has been set, on whom some of the people of Israel had set a price, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. So I feel it's kind of rich of these priest guys be like, well, that's blood money, so we can't have it in our treasury. Like, sure, we did like literally give the money to the guy as blood money, but like it can't come back to us because we're gonna be weird about it now. Yeah, that's kind of funny. Anyway, so and this first mentions the book of prophet Jeremiah, but actually Matthew was slightly mistaken here. The payment of the 30 pieces of silver comes from the prophet Zechariah, from the book of Zechariah. But the field of blood is from Jeremiah, and the potter's field is from Jeremiah. So it's interesting how he kind of blends those two stories together and just gives Jeremiah credit. But like Zechariah should also get some credit here. You know, he's not, name dropped as often, but he should, anyway. Not necessarily the point. However, in the book of Acts, which comes immediately after the Gospels, at the very opening of the letter of Acts, written by the... Really? You're just very jumping up and down today. Fine. So in Acts, the 11 remaining disciples get together and they're like, hey, so a little awkward here. There's 11 good guys left and we're not gonna talk about the other one. And so, they maybe someone should like take its place. So they still have the number 12 because symbolically 12 is, significant with the 12 tribes and everything. Anyway, so Acts 1:15-20. In those days, Peter stood up among the believers. Together, the crowd numbered about 120 people, which you might notice mathing here is 10 times 12 because 12 is a good and significant number. And Peter said, friends, the scripture had to be fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit through David foretold concerning Judas, who became a guide for those who arrested Jesus. For he was numbered among us and was allotted his share in this ministry. Now, this man acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness, and falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his bowels gushed out. This became known to all the residents of Jerusalem, so that the field was called in their language Hakeldama, which is field of blood. For it is written in the book of Psalms, let his homestead become desolate, and let there be no one to live in it, and let another take his position of overseer. So here in the earlier story in Matthew, Judas gives the money back, throws it at the floor, and then the priests are like, okay, well, what's the best thing we can do with this? We'll buy a field and bury poor people in it. I don't know. Whereas here, in the Acts telling of the story, Judas himself buys a field with the 30 pieces of silver, which is, again, technically the same end result. A field is bought, but definitely in very different ways. And in the Matthew, something good comes out of it, that it is a place where poor people can be buried without needing to buy a cemetery plot, whereas in this one, just like he died there, and the homestead shall now become desolate, in matching up with a line from Psalms. So in December, we went through some of the, as I like to call them, weird gospels and some kind of alternate versions of Jesus's childhood or birth or young adulthood. So I don't believe that we got to the Gospel of Nicodemus, which is very, very much apocryphal, very definitely not in our Bible for some kind of good reasons. But I did want to share this one little tidbit from it, which is an interesting addition to this kind of mythology of Judas. So in the Gospel of Nicodemus, which again, not in our Bible, Judas goes home to his wife and he's like, oh my gosh, how could I have done this? Anguish, angst. And he's just convinced that when Jesus inevitably rises from the dead, because even though, Judas betrayed the guy or delivered him into the authorities, got the coins, whatever, he's still like absolutely convinced Jesus is is going to rise from the dead. Like, regardless of whatever his reason was for doing the thing in the first place, he still thinks, yeah, Jesus is going to come back. And so when Jesus does return from the dead, Judas is going to be punished, which, I mean, that makes sense. But Mrs. Judas is like, what? No, Jesus is as dead as this chicken that I am cooking for dinner. Neither of them are ever going to come back to life. So anyway, immediately, chicken comes back to life and starts squawking, which is kind of horrifying because the chicken is on a spit being roasted over a fire, and that just seems like a mean moment for this chicken to be brought back to life. Like, I get the symbolism and like the point that the author is trying to make here, but I kind of, maybe I'm projecting as a vegetarian, I don't know, but I feel like it's not a very nice or loving God who would bring a chicken back to life that was skewered over a fire and I assume had its feathers picked off at that point. I don't really know how cooking chicken works, apparently. I'm now realizing as I say this. Anyways, this is kind of terrifying to me. It's not, I think it was meant to be kind of funny, but to me it's like, oh my gosh, that poor chicken. Anyway, yeah, so anyway, then Judas exits stage left and hangs himself. So, meanwhile, there's also the Gospel of Judas, which again, extremely apocryphal. More on that in a moment, and it cannot emphasize enough how apocryphal it is. Very much in our gospel, very much not in our Bible. Very much should not be in our gospel, in our Bible. But anyway, in that version, Judas has a vision of the other disciples stoning him, which is a kind of neat literary bit of foreshadowing. Well, not necessarily foreshadowing, but it's an interesting layer upon the story. So anyway, can these two biblical stories be reconciled? Matthew says, that Judas dies by suicide, whereas Luke in Acts says he just basically spontaneously combusts, which is kind of like a biblical thematic thing. Augustine of Hippo, who was writing in the, I want to say 5th century, anyway, somewhere in there, Augustine suggested that Judas hanged himself, and then later he fell off the rope, and then his body burst open, so that kind of reconciles the two stories. I don't know if that's necessarily the point. I mean, all four Gospels do say that Judas handed Jesus over to the authorities. That would be a really weird thing for any of the authors of the Gospels to make up, because it doesn't necessarily reflect well on Jesus. So therefore, every scholar agrees that this happens. For whatever reason that he did it, this was, Judas was involved in this. So is the point how he died? No, I don't really think so. I think it does say something that he felt deeply conflicted about it. I think that is a relevant aspect of the story, but anyway. So anyway, this brings us to, why did he do the thing though? We don't really have an answer to that. Maybe the dude just liked money. Maybe he was, basically a bird and liked shiny things. That was funny in my head. Maybe he was disillusioned that Jesus had not overthrown Rome, and it's seeming increasingly less likely that he's gonna be doing that anytime soon. Because, Jesus is supposed to be this great conqueror, this king who will change the world, which he does, just, not in the way that anyone was expecting. So maybe Judas is like, dude, I was backing you because I thought you were going to overthrow Rome, and you're not doing that. And our people are as oppressed as they've ever been, and not what I signed up for. So maybe Judas read the room and thought that sacrificing Jesus to the Roman authorities might prevent a more deadly reprisal against the Jewish people. because, they're really looking for Jesus to be arrested. They're looking at all these crowds that are following Jesus and getting pretty nervous about it. So it's entirely likely that if Jesus had not been crucified, maybe Rome would have taken things out on the Jewish people as a way of being like, hey, so we're in power here and we don't want you to forget that, because the so-called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, wasn't exactly an absence of disagreement. It was more that Rome, went and killed anyone who disagreed so that, it couldn't become something bigger. So, maybe that was a motivation that Judas might have had. Maybe he was just a jerk. I mean, that one doesn't really make sense, because if Judas was just like a bad guy to begin with, why did Jesus ask him to be one of the 12, and why did this not come up earlier in the text? I don't know. But who knows? Again, who knows? So, a bit more about the Gospel of Judas, as I said I was coming back to. It cannot overstate how much this is not biblical. And it was written about a century after Jesus' death, so that would be after any of the Gospels. So the Gospel of Judas frames Judas as a particularly beloved disciple who was asked to carry out a particularly difficult task so that Jesus' destiny could be fulfilled. That does kind of make sense to me, with some caveats, in a moment, with very, very much with caveats, because I feel that if anyone met Jesus, they would come away with an impression that he was unlike anybody else on earth, and that if they really spoke to him or had any opportunity to get to know him at all, they would understand that he was something not just different, but special and inherently good. And so I can't quite wrap my mind around how someone could leave everything, his job, family, home, whatever, and follow Jesus around for, maybe up to the whole 3 years of his ministry. Whereas Jesus is not a literal king on earth. He's not a famous, well-respected scholar. He's just this dude, the kid of some carpenter somewhere in some little town, whatever. But all of these people drop everything to follow him because of the impression that he has on them, not because he's got power or money or a title backing him. So Judas very much chose to follow Jesus. It's not like he was sent as a spy from the beginning, because from the beginning, who's this Jesus dude? Who even cares? Rome certainly doesn't care. So it kind of makes sense that there would be some other reason that this thing would happen that we just don't know about, and I guess we'll never know about. And I don't get it. I don't understand. I don't know. It would make sense to me in my worldview if there was something that we didn't know, that Judas knew that we didn't. I don't know. The biggest conclusion to take away is that Jesus is big and different and special and inherently good and the Son of God, etc. And these are some of the lesser details, because the point here is to love each other, Anyway, so the Gospel of Judas also says that there is a literal pantheon of lesser gods beneath our creator God. So in the Gospel of Judas, there's not one God, or even one God who is three in the Trinity. There's God and Jesus and a dozen or so lesser gods and angels who are gods, lowercase g. So that's a thing. It also says that some humans have souls like Judas, but then some humans don't have souls, and so when they die, they're dead, and nothing else. And I'm not entirely sure how that gets differentiated or why. So this gospel also says that Jesus can pop out of his body to take other forms, when he was a child, which... Okay. So the Gospel of Judas also says that Jesus says to Judas, you shall be cursed for generations, which I mean, I don't think anyone's gonna disagree with that. But then adds, but you will come to rule over them. And he also says to Judas in this weird apocryphal gospel, you will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. So this book is very much written in a Gnostic tradition that has pretty wildly different ideas of, what it means to follow God than we do. Yeah, so I want to back the one theme from this book, but it's in such a bizarre context that I don't know. In conclusion, Judas is complicated. It's basically all I can give you there. There are a few other apocryphal mythology stories about Judas that get even weirder, believe it or not, that I'm not getting into, but Judas has just become synonymous with the word betrayer, which is probably why there's not all that many American babies being named Judas, because apparently it's a worse name than Adolf or Ebenezer. Yeah. Jude is a much more common name than Judas, even though it's essentially like the same name, just a slightly different spelling or whatever. Anyway, so we'll be getting to, and I quote, Judas not Iscariot next week. He's less complicated, which is not really saying much. Anyway, in conclusion, Judas is complicated. Aspire to be a better person? Question mark? I don't even know what to conclude here other than that Judas is complicated. So, with that unfulfilling note, Ginger Snap and I hope to see some of you on Thursday for our fellowship Zoom at 5, one of her favorite times of the week because she sits and gets petted, and sometimes there are other cats. Last week there was also a dog on screen, so that was extremely exciting to me, not quite so much to the dog in question. Of course, on Sunday morning, we gather in person at 10, and our live stream starts at about 10:15, so that we can share our prayer concerns off camera without, sharing them with the whole internet. So, until then, good night from both of us.